Okay, so today's video is going to be about prokaryote and eukaryote cells, but we're also going to do a little bit of review about cell theory before we get started. Okay, so remember that cell theory has three parts that it talks about how cells make up life and where they come from. So first are that all living organisms are made up of one or more cells. So you can have an organism that's just one cell big, that's fine. But you can also have organisms that are many cells big, like us. This also means that if something like an object you're looking at doesn't have even one cell, then it's not living, okay? Dirt, rocks, metal, plastic, just things like that are not alive, okay? If it does not have at least one cell that reproduces and grows and uses energy and things like that, it's not living, okay? I've noticed that there is a lot of confusion among some of you of what's living and what's not. So we definitely need to get that straight. So if it has at least one cell, then it's alive. The one thing to point out here, though, is that if it was part of something that used to be alive, but it's not anymore, it can have cells and not be alive, okay? So a good example of this is wood. So when the wood is part of a tree and the tree is in the ground and it's growing and everything's good and it's reproducing, it makes new trees and grows and uses photosynthesis and all this stuff, then it's alive, okay? Once we cut the tree down and we use the wood to make tables or bookshelves or whatever, houses, the wood's not alive anymore, okay? So it's still made up of cells, but they're dead cells, okay? So it's not alive at that point. The second part is that the cell is the basic unit of structure, function, and organization in all organisms. So it's the basic unit of organisms, okay? You can't have anything more simple than a cell and have it still be alive, okay? We're going to talk about in a couple of boards down the line some of the different parts of cells. You can't take those individual parts out of the cell and have them survive on their own. It's kind of like us. If we were to take the individual parts of our body, like our eyes or our heart or our kidneys, and take them out of our body, they're not going to survive on their own because they aren't part of the larger body, okay? So you have to have a whole cell to have something be alive. And then lastly, all cells come from pre-existing living cells. So cells don't just appear out of thin air. We don't make them up. They come from other cells that have split apart. So say you have a big cell or even a normal size cell, and it will split in two, it'll split in half, and now we have two cells. And then this cell will split in two, and now it has two cells. And so that's where new cells come from, is from older cells that are already around. They split in half, and then they create new cells, okay? Also, keep in mind the cells have to be living. So like that wood that we talked about, when it's in the tree, it can divide and grow and be alive. But as soon as we cut that tree down, the wood that's sitting like at Home Depot, it's not splitting in half making new cells anymore because it's not alive. It's now dead, okay? So dead cells don't create new cells. Unfortunately, they're done, okay? And then last thing to review is that Robert Hooke, he's the guy that gets credit for discovering cells. He was looking at cork samples. You know, bulletin boards where you put the push pin in and it's this tan kind of spongy material. That's called cork, and it's from a tree. And he was looking at really thin slices of it under a microscope. And he noticed that there were these little boxes that looked like individual little jail cells. And that's actually why he called them cells. So he was the first to notice that. So good for him. All right, so enough for the review. Let's get to the new stuff. So there are different ways to compare cells. I know in primary school you probably learned about plant and animal cells. That's one way to kind of compare differences between cells. But we are going to compare them in a different way, okay? One way, or the way we're going to use, is to see if the cell has a nucleus. Okay, and a nucleus is basically a membrane-bound area of the cell that holds DNA. Let me back up and explain what all this stuff means. So a nucleus, that's just the name of the structure. is a membrane bound. So a membrane is a real thin, flexible kind of boundary, okay? It contains or it holds stuff to a certain area so it can't move past that. So it's this flexible kind of material that holds stuff together. And inside that membrane is the DNA. And the DNA is the brain of the cell. It tells the cell what to do, how to grow, how to reproduce, how to use energy, what to do, how to live. It's kind of like our brain. It tells us how to do everything. We can't do anything without our brain. Cell can't do anything without DNA. Okay? So if it has a nucleus and it has this kind of flexible area and the DNA is kept inside. Okay. A cell with one of those, with a nucleus, is called a eukaryote. Eukaryote. And I know it starts with an E, but you pronounce it with a U. So eukaryote. And some students have found that knowing that the U in eukaryote starts with EU matches the EU in nucleus. So these two words kind of match each other. If it has a nucleus, it's called a eukaryote. A cell without a nucleus, so it doesn't have to have a nucleus. Cell without a nucleus is called a prokaryote. And I remember this, that pro means no, okay, because that rhymes. So with a nucleus, eukaryote. Without a nucleus is prokaryote. And we will talk a little bit about the other differences between those two types of cells. Okay, let's start with prokaryote because they're the easier one to kind of know about. Prokaryote cells are usually very simple. They're kind of plain Jane, no frills, don't have a lot of stuff going on. Like they're real basic cells. They do not have a nucleus to keep the DNA safe, and the DNA floats around freely. So if you consider it kind of like our bodies, and the DNA is the brain, then in a prokaryote cell, the brain does not have the skull to keep it safe. It kind of floats around with all the other stuff. So the DNA is just kind of floating around the cell, bumping into stuff. It's not protected. It could get damaged at any time. It's not safe. There's not really anything keeping it from getting harmed. The DNA is also in a clump or a circle, so it's kind of just like clumped up together, and it can get tangled or messed up or damaged, and the DNA in a prokaryote cell just doesn't have a chance to really do too much because it's barely surviving. Prokaryote cells are always unicellular, so they're only one cell big. So they're these tiny little organisms that you have to use a microscope to see because they're so small. They're only one cell big. Because the DNA doesn't have a chance to kind of get very complicated or get very developed, these cells don't have a chance to split and grow and kind of become larger organisms than they are. So they're always just one cell big. And they do not have specialized organelles. So an organelle is a little part of the cell that has some sort of job, okay? It's kind of like our bodies, we have organs. These are organelles because they're like little baby organs, little babies, okay? So organelles, they have vacuoles and mitochondria and other little things in the cell that take away waste or use the energy or use for storage. But prokaryote cells don't have any of that stuff because they're super basic. So this is what a prokaryote cell might look like. So it has a cell membrane. So again, that's a flexible kind of thin material that kind of keeps the cell kind of contained to this amount of space, like it keeps it all together. So it has a cell membrane to keep the cell all together, but the DNA does not have a membrane around it, so it doesn't have a nucleus. So this is the DNA, it's all clumped up together, and it's just kind of floating around, hanging out in the cell, just doing whatever it feels like. So prokaryote cell, there's not really a lot to it. They're really basic. And then lastly, the other type of cell are the eukaryote cells. And again, the EU in eukaryote matches the EU in nucleus. So eukaryote cells can be much larger and a lot more complicated, okay? And the reason why is because they have a nucleus to keep the DNA safe. So the DNA, it's kind of like us, we have a skull, right? It's hard to damage our brain. It's hard to get in there. The brain is kept separate from other things. so that it can kind of do its job as well as possible without fear of getting hurt. Okay, so the DNA is also found in strands. So they're kind of organized nicely. They're kind of these like strips of DNA to where they're not going to get tangled or clumped up or kind of mashed together like in the prokaryote cells. So they're found in strands, and the DNA has a nucleus to keep it nice and safe. So because of that, eukaryote cells have more options. They can be unicellular. There are some that are only one cell big, but they're larger, more complicated organisms than the prokaryote one cell organisms. Or they can be multicellular. So any organism you've ever seen that's larger than one cell is a eukaryote. Okay, so this includes plants and animals. So both of those you learned in primary school, they're both eukaryotes. Fungus, invertebrates like worms, birds, trees, anything that you can see without a microscope that's living has to be eukaryote because they're the only ones that are multicellular. Okay, they do have the specialized organelles. So they have different little parts of the cell that have different jobs. So the mitochondria do energy, the vacuoles are used for storage, and you'll learn all about all the different kinds of organelles. So there's a lot. You'll learn all about those in 7th grade. So just know what an organelle is, but don't worry about the different types. So here's what a eukaryote cell might look like. It's a lot larger. It's a lot more complicated. So just like the prokaryote cell, it has this cell membrane around the edge of the cell to kind of keep it all together. Okay, and just like the prokaryote cell, it also has DNA over here. But notice it looks a little bit differently. This is much more clearly organized, and the DNA is not going to get tangled up on itself. Also, the DNA has this other membrane, this nucleus, so it has a large membrane around the whole thing, but then a membrane right around just the nucleus that keeps the DNA all together. So see, it's separate, kind of kept separate away from everything else. And then here, these black things are the different, these kind of blobs, organelles that kind of hang out in the rest of the cell, and they all have a job, and the DNA tells them how to do their job. So the DNA is like the brain or the boss of the cell. So prokaryotes are very simple, mostly like bacteria, and eukaryotes much larger, much more complicated, plants, animals, fungus, all those kind of good things.